So it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the first Aspen Institute event at this newly renovated Roosevelt House. Now, it's not just the smell of fresh paint that made us eager to open the doors. We simply really could not wait any longer to welcome you to this great, restored American landmark. It is fitting that tonight's program, a testament to the late, great Robert Tisch, is the first of many Aspen events that will take place at Roosevelt House, since Roosevelt House is now also the home of the Joan Tisch Legacy Project. This exciting public health program at Hunter College is also made possible through the generosity of Lori, Steve, Jonathan, and Lizzie Tisch. In case you have not heard the story, FDR's mother, Sarah, built this beautiful home in 1908 as a wedding present for Franklin and Eleanor, with one stipulation. She kept half of it for herself. Hunter owes a huge debt of gratitude to Sarah because Eleanor soon spent as much time out of the house as in it, and she often found herself walking a few blocks uptown to the girls' school on 68th Street, Hunter College. A long and rich relationship developed between the Roosevelts and the Hunter community and lasted even after they left 65th Street for the White House. After Sarah died in 1941, the family arranged for Hunter to purchase the house. Franklin himself donated the first $1,000. For many years, the house serves as a popular student activity center. But when I became president in 2001, I was dismayed to discover it had been long closed and in desperate need of repair. We were determined to have it faithfully restored, and with the support of Chancellor Goldstein and city and state officials, we have made that dream a reality. This building is rich in the history of one of America's most important families. This is where FDR recovered from polio, and where he returned to find his mother waiting on the doorstep when he came home from the Biltmore Hotel as the country's newly elected president. We can envision him talking to the nation over the NBC radio from the parlor room you were in upstairs. In the dining room, we can picture Eleanor hosting gathering of women and human rights groups. This room that we're in right now is one of the few changes made to the original layout. The cellar and backyard were excavated to create this auditorium. Now, this was not the easiest thing to do, since you cannot get a backhoe into the backyard of a townhouse in Manhattan. The only way we could remove all the dirt was through the front door, only to find out that the nearest dumpsters were down the street and around the corner. The other change is on the 6th floor, where we converted once cramped servants' quarters into what we hope are the two most coveted apartments in New York City. One of our first residents will be the inaugural Joan Tisch Distinguished Fellow in Public Health, Dr. John McDonough, who is Chief Advisor on Healthcare to the late Edward Kennedy. Dr. McDonough is teaching healthcare policy at Hunter and speaking out on health reform, and I hope all of you will join us on the health policy forum he is doing for us on April 6th. In addition to hosting other exciting public programs like tonight's event, the Roosevelt House Institute will support faculty research and serve as an inspiring center of student learning. Many of our students are already planning to enroll in our new programs in public policy and human rights. I believe that the Roosevelts saw their dreams reflected in Hunter College. Hunter College was founded on a commitment to education and opportunity for all, regardless of class, race, or ethnicity, which was quite progressive in 1870. In the 140 years since, we have never wavered from this mission. Every day on one of the most diverse campuses in the nation, we renew our commitment to making the American dream come true. By naming Hunter number 2 among best value public colleges in the nation, the Princeton Review acknowledged in January what we have known all along, that we offer the best education money can buy at a price our students can actually afford. We thank the Tisches for tonight's program and for our exciting public health program. To our Aspen friends, we thank you for this wonderful partnership. Bob and your board, this is a testament to your extraordinary foresight and hard work. And we thank you, Anna, Damian, and Neda, for helping us christen this beautiful home. Thank you so much.
Well, it seems appropriate that to have Jennifer describe this to us, and her involvement makes you realize we talk about the difference that leadership makes, and you should feel quite good about what you've accomplished here, and we're sure all pleased to share this with you. I know I feel that for the Institute, and I'm sure that the sponsors of tonight's evening would say the same. So here we are, and this is the third installment of the series, the Aspen Leadership Series, Conversations with Great Leaders, in memory of Preston Robert Tisch. It's an exciting new program, and it's gotten off to a great start. As you may know, Cory Booker, our mayor of Newark, and Jamie Dimon, the chairman and CEO of J.P. Morgan, have been recent speakers, and they provided quite interesting comments, and I think ideas that all of us can benefit from their success and their experiences. So tonight we continue, but before we continue, we have to say how grateful we are to the children of the late Bob Tisch, whose life work inspires us not only to think and talk about great leaders and great leadership, but also to put it in a frame or a lens of what we individually can do. I was talking to Jonathan a little earlier tonight about his book coming up. You didn't ask me to plug the book, but it's okay that I did. coming out in April. May, pardon me. And but I do think what they've done and the examples they've put, and whether Jonathan, Lizzie, Stephen, and then also Laurie, who's been very involved in the Institute, is just quite iconic for all of us, and we're most appreciative to you. Also, to your mom, Joan, who's here tonight, thank you for all you've done. So I think really that at the Institute, this seems to fit well with what we think about, because we talk a lot at the Institute about values-based leadership and nonpartisan solutions to complex and important problems. And we began in some ways talking about finance or about government, but I think it's also quite exciting that we've kind of moved this to the arts and to have that be the frame of reference for our discussion this evening. I'm not going to do the introductions, but I was looking at this and I kind of thought about it, and you have a program that has great biographies, but I just liked the 2 or 3 words. Anna Deavere Smith, playwright, actor, educator. Damian Woetzel, arts activist, former New York City Ballet principal dancer. And those are the descriptions that are good enough for me, but you can read a lot more. And now my job is to turn it over to Neda Ulaby, who's going to be leading the conversation. And so, with no further ado, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start by saying that covering the arts these days feels uncomfortably close to being like a war reporter. It feels almost like every day I'm covering the closing of another great playhouse, another museum, another opera company, another ballet company. It's not, and this is a fairly new turn of events, and it's part of an ecosystem that the 2 of you live inside. I wanted to start off, it was just a couple weeks ago that the fiscal year for 2011 with the arts budget was announced, and people were disappointed by it. At the federal level, it's bad. At the state level, it's worse. I just so that we are all sort of have some common ground to talk about the state of arts spending right now. It's really bleak, and it's getting bleaker. In Michigan, for example, the arts budget was cut 80%. The arts budget for the entire state for next year is $2 million. In Florida, it was 65%. Virginia just got rid of its entire arts council. It's grim. Arts has become a third rail, a gold-plated luxury item for a lot of these states, and understandably so, given what else they have to deal with. And what I want to ask the 2 of you is, what do you see when you look out into this fairly blasted landscape of arts funding?
Listen, there's a lot there to digest, but the first thing I thought about when you started that along those lines is that this is not a new problem, first of all. This is an existing problem. Art studies today over the last years show that while the supply of art has gone up, the demand has gone down. I think it's a time when people do prioritize, people do look at things a little differently than they did perhaps a few years ago. I think some of the assumptions that just because it's there, that means it should be there, are being challenged across the board, whether it's arts or other things, and why would the arts be any different? That said, I think that this times actually there are challenges in many ways for arts institutions to keep up with the times, aside from fiscally, attention span issues. This world, when Heather and I were talking this morning, you can go onto YouTube and watch Leonard Bernstein conducting, or you can go to the Philharmonic. And it's that easy, that choice, and it happens every day. And, but to turn that around, Bernstein himself would have said, but that's the challenge the arts need to do better. That's what we need to pull and make better art, if you will. So I look at it, kind of in 2 different ways. One is that there's an obvious supply and demand issue already, and these kind of budgets only exacerbate the threshing process a little bit, and everybody has to fight. And I think there's great success stories out there too. And I think especially being in this house right now, the idea that the arts are actually a resource They are not a gold-plated luxury item if they're handled in a way that they actually can help society. They can help education. They can help civic renewal. They can help so many different things if they are guided in that direction rather than simply being thought of as something that everybody perpetually in the arts feels is that we have our hands out. And I think that that relationship is probably what needs to be changed, and I think there's an opportunity in this environment to do just that, to show how the arts can actually be of service and of help and inspiration and art for art's sake, of course, and yet there's so much more to be said.
What is one of those success stories? What's an example of
Oh,
a
I
model?
think the arts around, certainly in this city, we can see things all around the city of the way arts has helped the city survive. Times Square, for instance, New 42nd Street, just the East Village. When I moved here, it's a completely different place. Chelsea. You look at how the arts have enlivened civic renewal. Restaurants, jobs are created through the arts in this city. Around the country, it's happening in places outside of Phoenix. There's many places that you can look where the arts are actually having a positive effect on the economy, and also how they go into the inspiration factor, into the creative country that we can be or not be.
I'd like to say something about that, which is that one of the things, I like to think of history, recent history, and one of the things that art has done, and I think it has an opportunity to do it again, is that it has stimulated the imagination of Americans, for example, to begin to imagine a country that is better in some ways, perhaps more just in some ways. I think about the civil rights movement. Can you imagine a civil rights movement without We Shall Overcome and with the many different recordings of it? Can you imagine it without the poets and the playwrights? Can you imagine it without the Free Southern Theater, which is a theater that meant a lot to me to learn about? And so even as I'm very concerned when I read what you read and hear what you've just condensed for us, I also think that there's a call for us as artists to be more rigorous and to be disciplined enough to say, well, what is it that's not being said in the papers by the policymakers, by the sociologists, by business? What's not being said? That's really where we're supposed to start. As I understand it, the nonprofit theater came about as an arm to the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. So part of it has to do with how we think about what we're doing. Some of my students are here tonight, which really pleases me, 3 of them. And one of the things that I talk about all the time to them is that confidence is overrated and that doubt is important. And I think that the artist is always in that position of being in doubt. Is what I'm trying to do is not quite right. And to even think and cultivate doubt as a place from which to begin to envision the world around you. So even as I think the news is distressing on an economic level, I'm not convinced that it's distressing on a creative level, except in as much as it denies children who are not wealthy the opportunity to have training, and other people who may need a push to think about how they can express themselves differently. And I also agree with Damian in terms of the competition that we have for people's attention. Just in the last 6 months, I've had to ask people who sponsor me as a speaker to add the following to their introduction. Please turn off your cell phones, and please do not text while Ms. Smith is speaking, because she can see it and it's disruptive, whatever. Right. So, I mean, people come to the theater now, they're texting away. Kids in university sitting there on their laptops. I mean, decorum has gone to, that other place.
Absolutely.
Well, and you could argue it's partly because we don't learn how to be audiences anymore, or not that we all learned how to be audiences, but arts education was much more part of the fabric of American education than it is now.
That's true. I mean, there's obviously that issue that is, well understood and yet grappled with none for the better because we understand it. The fact that, when I walked into a public school, I was handed a musical instrument and all this happens, and it just doesn't happen that way for so many children today, and it just won't change for them. There are generations that haven't had that.
Well,
and that changes the understanding of any of it.
That's true. On the other hand, I was not handed a musical instrument. I grew up in a city that was, for all intents, segregated. And I was not handed a musical instrument or anything like that. But there were a group of people who believed in oratory, at least, and so we spoke poems and said songs and made plays and sang. I mean, we sang songs, said songs, played, and drew pictures. And in that case, it's not just about the resources, but about a belief in expression that is really very deep, and I think we'd have to question why that belief has gone away. How can we revise what we're doing to bring back confidence in the belief that expression has value?
Right.
And what do you think that, is there an answer to that?
I don't know, I wish Maxine Greene were here, a great philosopher. I'm sure she has something to say about it, but I don't really know the deep reason why that belief is gone away.
There is something that in the matting kind of cycles that we all go through today that is different than 25 years ago. That constant buzz and constant a grab at the attention that you'd think eventually will cry out for the moment of clarity when you can actually hear a song or hear a speech. And I think that we've seen that can happen. I, for one, think that, yes, we can change the world. I actually think that's, the reason the election went the way it did in the end was that song. Was a moment in time where it changed the world. It actually did.
You're right, and speaking of songs, this particular writing on the wall here is something in the 80s. Somebody asked, how old were you? I was old enough. That I used to waltz to this. I found a recording of this very bunch of words in a used bookstore on Madison Avenue when they had bookstores on Madison Avenue. And when you hear this spoken by FDR, what you hear is a waltz. Mm-hmm. And so that, the great speeches do have in them artistry that's not just the brilliance of the oration, but really singing. Because why was he saying this in a waltz rhythm? Because he needed the world to dance with him. And I think that, that kind of power of those things that are beneath the words and beyond the words is what we lose by not rallying around to find some kind of way, whether it's money or an idea, to revitalize our arts and give people the courage to come to expression as a form of love and as a form of creativity.
And a form of community.
And a form of community, exactly.
Yeah.
Because arts have a great convening power.
Well, and there's lots of, easy talk about common languages, but they are, in fact, a common language. Let me disagree. We don't all like the same kind of music. We don't all like the same kind of things, but they are something that every town square can feel, given the opportunity. And you still see it, but not enough in my book. I just think it's a way to help this country. I think it's a step forward.
Can you talk about the project that you're doing that's really doing exactly that with this pilot program in New York right now?
I can. I hope.
Fantastic.
I can try and talk about it. It's not my project. It's Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road have a program called Silk Road Connect, which is in its pilot year in New York City Public Schools, 6th graders. There are about 478 of them, I believe, 5 different schools, different boroughs. And what it is, it's learning curriculum through the arts. It's how can music help with geography. It's how can calligraphy help understand culture. It's finding the path of civilization, essentially, through the arts. And there's musicians that go in, and I've helped a little bit with dance, and there's calligraphy and art and storytelling and film. And it is a small intervention. It's tiny. We go a little bit. It happens, on a very small scale. And yet, it's something that I've been doing a little bit over the last months. I was in the Bronx yesterday. I'll be in Williamsburg on Monday. And it just changes one's life to see how it changes kids' life. It's just the moment when you see it pass over a child's face that they get it. They get something through, and it's through the music. It's through the theater of it. It's what theater can say that, just telling somebody something can't. And that's, let me talk about you for a minute. the way you inhabit our lives and people's lives. You say things that just reading can't do. You say things in other people's voices. And I said this to you a minute ago. It's been said because you're using people's actual words. But somehow I know so much more about Watson or Wilson or the characters you played just now from all across the country, but it's through art that it actually captured an imagination that is just, you can't compare it. You can't. And these kids get that. These kids get that.
Let me talk about you for a minute.
Okay, let's do that.
What, you know, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me is
We're out of time.
You know, you step off of a stage as a ballet dancer and you walk into the Kennedy School for Government and you somehow are able to make sense of what's going on there. I mean, you know, it's like not exactly a hop, skip, and jump from the stage of the New York City Ballet. And so, you know, this idea of leadership, you know, we find not just by turning someone like Damian into a artistic director, but as a person who has a civic sense and a civic interest and can provide civic leadership. And I think that arts do also render new kinds of leaders, new kinds of social innovation. And so as we start to even think about how we're educating people, I think we need to take some of them out of the conservatory and open the windows and open the doors and bring them in the world. And, you know, most of us, you know, who are over 35 are a product of conservatory training and the idea of the artist as a very special human being who shouldn't concern him or herself with the world. And so part of it comes back to us again. What kind of a future do we want to create? Are we going to just continue to, you know, bring people into MFA programs and there's not going to be enough jobs for them?
Right.
Or do we think of other ways to ask people to use expression and gift to convene people and bring people together?
And it's like a part of public service. It's a part of, I mean, I always, I go back to the idea of, you know, if you think about any trouble the arts have in this country from a meta point of view, it's the fact that there isn't a top-down validation of the arts that really sings in this country right now.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean like JFK's Amherst speech. That's what we're still coasting on. That you don't have much after that really says the arts are an important part of this country, the arts are at the center of our civilization, they're what we're going to be remembered for in the end. It's the duty of the artist to not only to inspire us, but also to reflect us, to bring us up short, essentially, and not just cater to us, but, you know, show us who we really are to some extent. That validation doesn't exist. It's more that it's, you refer to third rail, gilded thing, and I think that if that exists, the rest somehow falls into place in some way.
But is that validation always a good thing? I like to think about Lincoln.
We're not going to have that CIA discussion,
no,
are we?
No. Oh, don't remind me. Anyway, he and I got in a considerable amount of trouble in Paris for running our mouths in a way that wasn't appreciated. But I like to think about Whitman and Lincoln, okay? So they never met. They passed each other on the street. And in fact, Whitman was able to say things, not just because he was a poet, but because he could, from the outside, say things that a president can't say from the inside. And so on the one hand, I think the validation is useful, but I don't think it's the only way.
Absolutely not.
And in fact, we should worry if that's the only place it can happen.
It's not a validation that it's all good, that it's all appropriate. It's a validation that it's important, that it is essential. I mean, Whitman's perfect. I mean, you know, he had the moment, he had the good sense to that line, do I contradict myself, then I contradict myself. I am large. And if there's anything that's missing in our society today, it's that sense of nuance, that we can be that large, that we can have bigger thoughts that maybe don't exactly mesh, but there's that sense of an evolved society which has been, you know, taken to a point that, no, that's what you said, that's it. This is it.
Well,
this
that's
is it.
the problem.
You're here, we're here, you're there, and you're over there.
But in a society where it's the largest of our TV screens, it seems to be more of the yardstick. It is arts funding, right, that will be able to help create this kind of
That's about
transformative,
arts
you know,
funding
it is the
thing.
topic, and I
Yeah.
am the moderator. How have the two of you seen arts funding change over your long and storied careers as artists and activists?
Well, I've certainly seen it change, but in my case of my own work, at least in the very beginning, no one was funding me. So,
It's all up.
you know what I mean? I mean, part of it is I'm coming from that. It's not like I got a grant or I applied for a grant. I did, at that level, figure out how to fund what I was doing and how to teach myself what I was doing. So the reason I'm kind of keep stressing that there is this other space to occupy, it's not in disrespect of the very serious idea in front of us, but I don't want us to, I mean, what is the arts fund? I mean, when you say arts funding, what are you talking about? Are you talking about government? Are you talking about donors? What are you talking about?
Yes.
Let me ask you.
Yes, we have been talking, the examples I was giving, for example, were all government funds, and those, of course, can range from, you know, a big NEA grant to the kind of funding that goes from a city commission to a artist who's been working, doing performance art in a warehouse, you know, vary from the macro to the micro. It's really across the board, and that's what's most frightening about what so many artists are facing. There's a theater in Washington, D.C., where I live, called Woolly Mammoth, that's losing huge chunks of its funding because a lot of it was coming from the city. And that's the kind of place that a young Anna Deavere Smith would probably have her first show if she happened to live in Washington, D.C., or one of her first shows.
Well, I think that probably
She would have done it anywhere.
Well, that's true.
One-
And so
one-
will the young one.
one possibility is, well, and I did do it anyway.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
And every dance
nobody,
that-
nobody
All artists
recognized
will.
what I was doing
That's
until I was
right.
40,
All artists
40,
will,
40
right.
It's like
years
saying you
old.
need a choreographic, you know, situation to try and create a dance.
But we should.
I
we
made
should be-
dances
we
in a
should be-
garage. We make a dance wherever you know you need. You find the space if that. That's,
Well, we should be careful because I don't mean to underestimate how devastating this is.
Right.
But it does make me think that it could be that there need to be more almost unofficial groups of people rather than the usual suspects who are convening to think of new ways of doing this, of revising how this is done. You know, so I hope my
Absolutely.
students who are here are, you know, convening with each other to find and think about new ways to do it, new ways to approach funders, new ways to influence them. Or none of us in schools learn about patrons. We completely depend on large organizations to have those relationships. And half the time, the performers, unless they are stars, are not even invited to meet the patrons. And yet this relationship of artist to patron is of course back in antiquity.
Yeah.
So maybe we need to go back and look at that relationship in a way that isn't so top heavy.
Yeah,
What
I
do you
think there's a couple of things there. One thing, and I mentioned this to you earlier, is that from a point of view of running an arts organization in this country now, the levels of involvement in making sure that it is funded, I think, has gone up. I think that's something that's changed. I think it's more now, and not dissimilar to politics. You know, politicians, I remember at the Kennedy School, the campaigning course, they said, well, if you're not spending X amount of time fundraising, you're doing it wrong. And it was just crazy. It was like, I forget what they said, 60% of the time, that was what you did. You're on the phone, you're getting the money, you're shaking the hands, that's what you're spending your time doing. And I don't think it's all that different in the arts today. It's a political thing, when you're supposed to be actually making the art to some extent. And it's a catch-22 because oftentimes the person who's doing the programming can explain it much better, can actually do the fundraising probably better than the fundraising people can do, and that's why it devolves to that, and it's a vicious cycle, but it's not a productive cycle, and that has changed to some extent. But I want to say that some of it I just find mysterious, and happily
Right.
don't want to know how it actually happens, but I know that when I was a little kid, I went to ballet class, and it was free, and even to this day, I'm like, wow, they just thought, we need boys, so we'll give them free ballet. Okay. And that was it. It was just a given. I never really thought about it that much. Certainly didn't think about it then. It still goes on today. Because there's a shortage of boys, the boys get to go for free. That's how it is. And it doesn't matter how bad off the place is, they're not charging the boys in many ways. that's kind of an amazing thing right there. I don't know. I don't even know where to place that. But my whole schooling was free. I don't think.
I mean,
it
I
didn't
wish
happen.
we could be more like, look at athletics for their models, although they also have a problem. I was lucky enough when I was in Austin performing to have somebody hook me up to get trained, believe it or not, by the trainers for the UT Austin basketball team. And, they have a problem that, kids are not having gym, right? But somehow they still have the resources to go find some of the talent and to, take charge of that talent at a very high level. We don't, in the arts, really have any kind of a thing comparable to that. And, if there was someone in this audience who wanted to fund an enterprise like that, I think it'd be pretty cool to think of a way of sending performers sending Juilliard or NYU into schools and take it in our own hands. Find the people and raise them up to the standard.
Or develop some of these models that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's the challenge, is to develop any of these models because of the pressure, certainly in education, that go on in this country today. And I run into this in a program that was brought to Colorado. Heather, my wife, helped make this happen. Celebrate the Beat, which is a offshoot of Jacques D'Amboise's National Dance Institute, came to this place where I run a festival in the summer, had a success, is now in the public schools, hundreds and hundreds, actually thousands of kids getting this dance music education, but every step of the way had to push and fight and beg and plead and explain that it wasn't going to take away, and the teachers in the end weren't going to get fired because the test scores went down, and that everything was going to work out. And in the end, it works out. But and the same thing, even the things I'm going through in all ways. It's just explaining that it's a value. That's what I get back to the validation.
Right. I mean, I think that we have to, again, get underneath this to find out why expression got devalued, so that we can grab a hold of it.
Distrust of expression.
That's what I call it.
We have time for one more question for me before turning it over to you. And there's a signature question that the series wants all of the leaders to answer, and that is, what experience or what is inexperience that you had along the path of who you became that helped shape who you are?
Anna, you got it?
You go. You go, boy.
Listen, I'm going to give you a three-part question, question to your answer. Now, I think that I can't really pick one thing, but I think that having the experience that I had was having the opportunity to choose. I had the opportunity to choose. I was given a lesson in dance. I tried to play the flute. So there were languages, there were other things in my past. And I often have thought, when people said, why did you dance? And I said, well, it was one of these things, and suddenly everything started dropping away. Everything didn't start dropping away. It was what felt right. It was what I was good at. It's where the attention came from. I can remember the moment I was at Boston Ballet School. I was taking class at 4:30 to 6. I was supposed to get picked up at 6. Ride didn't come till 7:30. I hung out. The company was rehearsing. It was that kind of place. It only had like 2 studios, so the company had to wait till the students finished. I mean, it was like, it was in the South End. It was a mess. And waiting for that ride, a ballet master said, well, as long as you're here, try this. And I did. Changement, 2, 3, 4, 4th, turn, turn, turn. And it was never the same. That was it. I knew I could dance. He knew I could dance. People around knew I could dance. And suddenly I was like I was dancing. And the flute was gone. And the Chinese lessons were out. And it was one after another. But
dance is it's a crucial part, but it's one part of who you are.
But that's the same thing, but it extends. It's having that opportunity to find out, to get to go to the Kennedy School, and that's about people supporting me. And it's about curiosity to some extent. It's also about a certain amount of audacity, probably. And I think that that's what the arts can provide. It's what was provided to me, but it is kind of self-fulfilling to some extent. I mean, one of the ideas that I think this country is ripe for is the idea of the arts as public service, an artist's corps, where the arts enliven the public communities, education, we just talked about, economic revitalization, cultural diplomacy, then there's so many more jobs to be had for artists than we can ever even imagine, actually, if you start to look at what they can really do.
Anna, what was your experience?
Well, let me just say I couldn't agree more about public service, and I also think that one of the things that not all but many artists think about is, the vulnerable person. And I think that there are many ways to bring art and art making into communities in such a way that we can address people who are vulnerable and help them imagine another possibility than the one they are in, so much so that they can become a part of changing the condition around them. And that sort of activist way of using art, which was probably alive in my rather conservative, all-black elementary school, nonetheless, the power of what art can do to give you a sense of mastery and your ability to change what's wrong around you so that you become an active participant in your society. I mean, mine was that I wasn't planning on being an actress when I was in college, but I did want to do something for social change, and I left the then unfortunately named Beaver College for Women, now called Arcadia, which I'm proud to say the president just made his healthcare speech there the other day. Nonetheless, I left Beaver College and went across country looking to do something for social change. And pretty much that was over when I arrived in San Francisco. And I happened by chance to go to an acting class, again, not really thinking it was anything I would do, but I thought, oh my goodness, people are changing. So maybe I should stick around and see what this is about if I want to do something on a larger level. And I guess the lights went off when my Shakespeare teacher on the first class told us to take 14 lines of Shakespeare and say them over and over again until something happened. And I took my lunch money and went to the Tenderloin, where that's where all the down and out people live. Nobody was buying complete works of Shakespeare, so it was easy to get one cheaply. And I went to my little apartment in a basement, and I didn't even know where the 14 lines of Shakespeare were. I was just looking for any 14 lines that any woman was saying, and I came upon Queen Margaret in Richard III, who is very upset with Richard's mother, and so she begins to scream at her something to the likes of, that dog that had its teeth before its eyes, to worry lambs and lap their gentle blood, thy womb let loose, to chase us to our graves. So I said this over and over again in my little basement apartment for about 4 hours, because I was such a goody-goody. And with no influence of drugs or anything like that, I saw Queen Margaret. She was there. And, somebody had said the actor's gift of his imagination, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is like when I was a child and I saw the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus. There is Queen Margaret. And so for the next 37 years, I wanted to find out why saying those words over and over again made this vision of a full-fledged person come into my apartment. And that is what I have been unsuccessfully doing.
She served her purpose. Clearly, she did what she was supposed to do. Let me turn it over to you all, sir. There's a microphone that's coming over to you.
2 comments, and I would be happy for the speakers to comment on the comments. First, is there a silver lining to the cloud about reduction of government, whether it's national, state, or local, support for the arts, and the increased emphasis on trying to pair artists with donors? Of course, government funding comes with some strings usually. So is that not something that at least has some silver lining if, as Ms. Smith suggests, we try and get the patrons and the artists together in a greater way, because there's a greater need to do that? The second comment I want to make is I think our country is really blessed. 50 years ago, people were wondering whether we could ever develop regional theater. The Guthrie was just starting. Now the quality of regional theater, even regional opera, I mean, our country really is a haven for the arts generally. And yes, we may be in a downturn of public funding, and maybe it was because of public funding and the Amherst speech of Kennedy that over the last 50 years we have really developed, at least it seems to me, a national arts spirit and institutions that, to me, having lived through that transformation, are just amazing.
Well, I think that what you say is absolutely true, but it may be that now is the time to rethink that large institutions were created. I think of one of my heroes, Zelda Fitch-Handler, who, of course, was instrumental in starting the Arena stage. And it could just be that we have to do something that's not very sexy and think about smaller local enterprises as a way of rejuvenating this. What do you think, Diane?
I think you're brilliant. So, I just went to a Salzburg Global Seminar about a month ago. The topic was the arts in lean times. And what was interesting was it was filled with people from developing countries, not just the U.S. And they were sitting and looking at us like, so let me get this straight. You have a $50 million budget that was reduced by 10% and you lost part of your endowment. That's your crisis? And they're literally, they're in the Middle East dealing with, all sorts of politics and dangerous circumstances trying to make art. They're in developing countries where there's no infrastructure whatsoever trying to make art. And it was actually, to my mind, I didn't learn anything, I think, substantially about how to think about this economic crisis of big institutions, but I think that's maybe one thing I walked away with was maybe all we're talking about here is the crisis of 100 big institutions. Somebody at that conference said that, and we're conflating that with a crisis in the arts. And that art itself continues to speak to people. Artists continue to speak to people. Artists can convene. Artists are making great work. But we have a crisis of having overbuilt infrastructure, perhaps. But I'd be curious, I haven't actually traveled around the world the way you have, and I don't know your history enough to know if you have as well, but if in your travels, if you've reflected on the sort of the distinctive role of arts in other countries versus the U.S., and if that begins to get at some of this, what is it that's underneath of it all, but why we're not?
Well, I'm sure that Damian has, but I will quickly say that when I was in Rwanda 10 years after the genocide, I was traveling with a playwright, a wonderful playwright, Hope Zeta, who I had sponsored at the Institute on the Arts and Civic Dialogue, which I had been running at Harvard. And she was so excited that I had come to Rwanda, and she wanted me to see a play that she had written that was meant to help her country heal from the genocide. But the only space she could find to show it to me in was, I don't know, like a 800-seat house or something, big. And she was really embarrassed because she said, we will go there tomorrow night and it will just be you and a couple of other people, and it's so embarrassing. That place was packed for people who wanted to see that play that they had seen 10 times because they needed to see it. And that's why I talk about art coming from a place where we really have something to say,
right.
And we really need to say it because government's not saying it, business isn't saying it, school's not saying it. And so in that horrible nightmare, they don't have psychoanalysts helping them with post-traumatic stress syndrome. This whole country needed that play. So I think that I have seen.
Bravo.
Damian, you mentioned early on in your comments the ability to create jobs through the arts. And when you have an understanding of that, and there are others that have an understanding of that fact, and we're at a moment in time where we desperately need to create jobs, and then you went on to say that in many communities the arts are interwoven into the economic fiber of art.
Could be better, yeah.
Have we not told the story well, or have individuals such as yourselves?
The narrative is deeply flawed. It's not there, and I think that there's certainly a strong push to remedy that right now. Certainly, at the National Endowment for the Arts, Rocco Landesman's initiatives are all based on very much on how the arts work. Art works is the motto, and it's all about how the jobs can come from it. And so I think that narrative is being worked on and improved daily. Whether it will take is another story. I think that it requires a certain amount of trust, and I think there is certainly, the cultural divides in this country and distrust of the arts, I actually think are alive and well, and the certain distrust of the arts in general in this country as part of our history, certain effeteness, that sort of thing, which has to be dealt with, I think, from a validation point of view more. So in answer to your question, yeah, I think the narrative hasn't been good. I think it will get better. I think there are great heroes of this around the country. There's one in the back over there, Kate Levin, who just makes, everything seem easy in some ways, and except it's just so difficult. But from an artist's point of view, it seems self-evident. It's like, well, yes, this works, this works. I just want to follow up on that just for a minute about the institutions. I couldn't agree more. I think there's been an element of institutional blindness in there's been irrational exuberance everywhere, in the arts as well. Feeling the big institutions we deserve, we have, and in many cases they do, but in many cases you can always do things better. You don't have to apply a Jack Welch principle to it and cut the 10% every year, but maybe you should look a little harder at what you're actually accomplishing for all that work and raising the money and the churn of the money. On the contrary, though, I think that the real toll on artists around the country in the smaller places is very real, because those institutions are also being cut, and those cuts are more the stories that you were talking about. Those are the bigger ones.
The whole thing that African Americans used to say, when white folks get a cold, black folks get pneumonia. So, when the big institutions get a cold,
that's right.
the smaller institutions get pneumonia, and back to who gets to try.
That's
or
right.
even think about
And
expressing
yet those
themselves.
choices that I talked about, all of that, it just
Yeah.
doesn't even happen.
So
And
that's-
where will the big institutions get the people in another 10 years? These smaller institutions, which is where people would get fostered and raised and would grow up, are withering.
But I like the way you framed that about the story, because in the end it is a story to be told to some extent. It is to capture the imagination of you can talk and say it's about jobs and economics, but it's actually a story. It is. How do the arts enliven our lives, and how do they help, and why would we? All of that has to be expressed better. It's our responsibility.
Don't we also have to look again at education and make sure that in the places we're training people to be artists, that we are training them to be workers?
Yes. Well, and also about
in addition to virtuosos, right?
Virtuosos, and also about having an element involved in every sort of training, whether it's arts or others, that is also about community and service. I think if there's one thing we've learned in the last recent years, but also longer, is that the emphasis on what one can get has not served us very well. What one can get out of things as opposed to what one can give. So I think the arts are a part of that.
Speaking of stories, Michael Chabon wrote the absolutely most breathtakingly beautiful statement on the president's policy on the arts. And I'm curious, since you're on that council, and because we're sitting in this particular home, where's the WPA?
Where is it?
Where's the bringing it back? I mean, this would seem like the time in
I
the
think
world.
you're seeing, I mentioned Rocco Landesman at the NEA, and certainly at the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities, and I'm not going to speak for that entity. I'm here as a private citizen, obviously. But every effort is being made and discussed about exactly that, and not just specific to the WPA. WPA was WPA, and these are our times, but those principles hold. Those principles hold, and I think that there's been expressed, certainly in that arts policy platform, the idea of the Artist Corps is there, and efforts are being made with members of the committee, including myself and Yo-Yo and Chuck Close, and so artists mixed with other figures from around the spectrum to try and make that a reality because of the general recognition that it is, its time is back.
Not only that, back to the narrative, when you list those people, I can't think of a better bank of imagination to come up with a narrative that creates whatever the new one is.
It's, I agree entirely, but it scares me too, because there's nothing, well, I'm going to say there's nothing worse. There are plenty of things worse, but a bunch of artists standing around saying the arts are so important is not going to be the
No,
narrative
but
that
that's-
takes.
Of course not.
No.
But you're all smart enough and imaginative enough
Right.
to find the compelling one.
That's right.
Do we have time for one more?
I hope.
And by the way, it's a conversation that we've had at NPR. As a matter of fact, I think I was sitting at a table with a bunch of reporters who were covering all different kinds of things, and somebody said, "Why isn't there WPA?" And someone looked at them and said, "Because they're trying to do healthcare."
Well, actually, that's right.
That's right.
And I bet you if we go to MD Anderson Cancer Center, we'll find art being done as part of the healing process. And maybe even here in this city, there's sort of programs like that. Yeah, Sloan. Speaking of cancer.
Mr. Woetzel actually mentioned a very critical word, the word of choice, and how choice helped him become who he is, and how to choose the right profession and be in harmony with himself. And I would like just to back him up as a scientist and say that nature do the same way. And in this room we are like 50, 60 people, and we're all different for the simple way or fact that is DNA matter. We have the choice 10 into the 64 base pairs that become different. And that's the way that nature choose to not only to adapt to the new environment, but also to create something new. And the scientific word or translation of choice is diversity. And I think nature, through diversity, finds a way to create something new and to create something different. And I really strongly believe that arts is the only way that can create this diversity in life. So now I would like to ask you this question, that how do you think that art, specifically in education, because the problem today is that education is not diverse. It became, especially in this country, extremely specific and narrow. So I think we're missing general culture in our school today. So how do you think that arts could reinstate diversity in schools?
Well, I first just want to quickly say I was asking a geneticist at Stanford why my dog, who is a mutt, but part Australian cattle dog, why she knows how to herd. And he said it's DNA. And then I said, well, with us, how do we know what we know? This is a geneticist. He said, by culture. So it's pretty desperate that we pay attention to culture. I mean, or I won't be able to sing, and my dogs.
But I heard you.
Can hear. Well, I mean, I think in education, it's also a place where we need a compelling narrative, and I'm very distressed that Maxine Green, who is, how old is she, Lily? 95. I mean, I don't know who's taking over that mantle as just a great, compelling educator who can speak to educators. That's part of it too. Is we can't have an us and them relationship with the people who are deciding how our children are going to be educated. So it's relationships that we have to build, and small dialogues, local dialogues, and finding people who do trust each other and want to come on board to, I think, take small steps and therefore have models. What do you think, Thelma? You're nodding. No, Thelma Golden, the head of the Studio Museum of Harlem.
You're exactly right, but I also think it's a question of some of what you talked about, what you were saying, but also about the potential choice to have the arts be a valid way in and through education, and that's what has been lost.
I think that all bets seem to be somewhat off about how to teach. I don't know if some of you may have read this article in the Times Magazine last week, and just about the how to teach is up for grabs, and have we shot ourselves in the foot by trying this or by trying that? And finding a new model is coming. I think it's going to come down to very small sects of methods. Whether it's in charter schools, they do it this way, and that seems to be working. But the idea that the narrowing that you referred to, which is an attempt to somehow grapple with failure, essentially, because it has been failure.
And this is really one of the most wonderful things, right? Because here you're bringing up what's crucial. Arts themselves are changing. There are art forms happening on YouTube and in all of these different places that aren't going to get funded by any kind of traditional funder. The population of the United States is changing. What we think of as art right now, there might be completely different things that are major forms of art in another 50 years. It's thrilling, but it's going to take very creative arts funding in order to nourish new generations of artists and in order to set the pace of what art in the United States is going to be.
However, I think we can't underestimate what you just said in terms of actually a different way of looking at that, is that these kids, I remember when Urban Bush Woman, they used to come out and say, you say the dance is dead, but it's happening in the schoolyards, and it's happening here, and they go, boom, and they're dancing, and you're like, whoa, that is dance, right? So there are all these ways that people are expressing stuff. I have a student at NYU who came over to me and wanted to know if I could tell him something about interviewing, because he was going down to New Orleans to interview these bounce rappers, right? One of them called Sissy Noby. I go, Sissy Noby. And, there is stuff going on that is not, in the places where there are big endowments.
Right, exactly.
And so,
those non-traditional things. I mean, we're
all
trying to
these
support many
non-traditional
things
places,
that are...
And they're finding
I don't
ways
wanna
to
say
do
it,
it,
but-
too. And so maybe there is a value, again, in using the convening power that arts and arts organizations have to say, come show me what you're doing.
Right.
We have to create in our own society, whether it's small, large world, the new, I heard Elliot Feld say this once, and no pejorative connotation meant, new peasant dances. What are our peasant dances? You still go to the ballet school and you learn a mazurka. Is that really relevant? I don't know. Where are the new peasant dances? What is it? Bounce rapping?
Bounce rapping.
There you go.
We are all going to be going forth, inventing our own peasant dances for the, and much inspired by our two guests tonight. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Let's talk about
And it's my job just to say thank you to several people. I think, once again, Jennifer, thank you for having us to your new home. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Tisch family for their inspirational ideas that got this started. Neda, thanks for convening the conversation. And then I also think, I should have said this earlier, I think for the Aspen Institute, we have a special relationship with Damian and with Anna, who have been artists in residence for the Aspen Institute, and Anna is a fellow board member. And so thank you for really inspiring us this evening. And good night, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.